Hello and welcome back to my channel, and I will be analyzing another poem from the GCSE English Literature AQA Poetry Power and Conflict Anthology. So today I'll be going through remains. First I'll give a reading of the poem, then some context of the poet Simon Armitage, and then an analysis of the entire poem. So first a reading. Remains. On another occasion, we get sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire, three of a kind, all letting fly, and I swear, I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this loser a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out. Pain itself, the image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, then he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave, but I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now, his bloody life in my bloody hands. Alright, so now that I've read the poem, I'll now give some context. So this poem is from a collection of poems written by Simon Armitage called The Not Dead, which was taken from a BBC documentary of soldiers who had survived wars, who talk about their experiences and how they've been permanently traumatized by war, how actions that they have done have permanently affected them, and still to this day they can remember details of what has happened. So now I'm going to do an analysis of the poem, but just before that I want to show you this sheet produced by the head of English of our school, which breaks down a poem into 6 main categories. Its theme, language features, structure features, context points, connections, and interpretations of the poem. One more key point before I start the analysis is in an exam situation when you're writing an essay, you always want to mention the effect of the quote, the effect of the language or structure device, because this is what at least half of the marks of the essay are for. So doing this can make a huge difference in your final mark. So here is my version of the sheet, which I've filled in. So I'll start off with the themes. So the first point on themes is the never-ending guilt felt by the soldier after he's killed the looter. And this is shown from the quote, his blood shadow stays on the street. Like the verb of it's staying on the street, there's no way for it to be removed. It's permanently there, and as he says, he walks over it week after week on patrol. And another key theme, similar to bayonet charge, is the indescribable horror of war, and that's shown through violent imagery, such as it rips through his life. So now, language. So the first and most notable technique used throughout is the colloquial tone, as if this experience is something that the soldier has gone through many times, and this is just another occasion as he begins. So legs is up the road, three of a kind, all letting fly, end of story, all of these colloquial phrases showing how the soldier might be attempting to normalize it to try and forget the horrible incident that had taken place. And this colloquial tone contrasts with the violent imagery. So for example, he's torn apart by a dozen rounds, and pain itself, the image of agony. These very vivid and violent images severely contrast with a colloquial tone. These violent images suggesting like a serious implication of the actions, compared to the colloquial tone as if it's just an everyday activity. The violence imagery is also shown through the violent verbs like rips through his life and tosses his guts back into his body. All of these very strong and very violent verbs, further highlighting the extreme violence that the soldiers had to commit in the war. Next, there's quite a few tone shifts throughout the poem, where where Simon Armitage has written something, for example, end of story, and then there's a pause, and then except not really, a major turning point of the poem, how what he thought has now been undermined. There's also a juxtaposition, which is an opposition of two ideas, where you have, say, for example, like a deafening silence. Those are two juxtaposed ideas. So in this poem, we have him, uh, now he's home on leave, but then the soldier is dug in behind enemy lines. So this imagery of war, even though he's at home, shows that the effects of the battle will never just truly disappear. Next, we have a figure of speech and metaphor. Right at the very end of the poem, his bloody life in my bloody hands. So his bloody life shows the impression of the blood that the soldier now has of the Luther, which is now completely imprinted into his mind. And in the second stanza, there is a loss of repetition of all three of a kind letting fly. Myself and somebody else. The repetition of there being other people could be perhaps a soldier attempting to remove the guilt from himself and to throw it onto other people. It was their fault, I didn't do it. However, his guilt could be incredibly personal, and the personal pronoun at the end is bloody life in my bloody hands, how he feels that it's his fault that the Luther was killed. And finally, we have sibilance, uh, not somewhere in the sun-stunned, sand-smothered land. So the sibilance is a soft S sound, which is repeated: sun-stunned, sand-smothered, and also the compound adjectives of sun-stunned and sand-smothered. The sun and sand potentially being a positive image, but then followed by stunned and smothered, these negative images which show how even the sun, which used to be enjoyed by the soldier, is now stunned. It's no longer enjoyable. It reminds him of the violent actions that had taken place. Now moving on to structure points. So we start off with the cyclical structure. So the poem starts off with one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. And later on in the poem, he again says sleep, and he's probably armed, possibly not. So this repetition shows that no matter what's happening, his mind always drifts back to the experience of killing the Luther. How it's completely embedded in his mind, and there's no escape from his horrible memory. Next, we have a caesura, which are used throughout the poem. A caesura is a brief pause in the middle of the line. So, for example, end of story, except not really. There's a pause in the middle of the line which causes the reader to stop and reflect. So, the end of story, there's a pause, and then except not really, the major turning point of the poem, caused by the caesura, which creates a pause, a gap, and breaks up the poem. Perhaps also showing the soldier's mental state and how it's constantly broken up and is deteriorating throughout. Next, we have enjambment, which is where a line runs along, where a sentence from one line continues onto the next line, or perhaps even a stanza, as we see in this poem. So, for example, I swear I see every round as it rips through its life. The enjambment continues throughout the stanza, and this could perhaps suggest how the experience is continuous. There's no stop to it, and it will continue ongoing even through the stanza. Next, throughout the poem, there's the use of first person, so I, myself, and somebody else, and my bloody hands. All of these first person pronouns referring to himself, showing how he might feel that the guilt is on himself, and he's giving it as a personal experience. And also as a first person, it could also give an effect to the audience, because it would make it a more immersive and vivid poem and allow them to experience it as the soldier had. And in addition, the poem begins with the in medias res, where it begins in the middle of an action. So on another occasion. So it's as if it's in the middle of a conversation, and the soldier is telling stories to the audience. And beginning with "on another occasion," it suggests that incidents like this have been constantly occurring throughout his career. So next we'll move on to context, as I'd explained earlier. So this poem is not autobiographical. It comes from a collection of poems, "The Not Dead," which was published in 2008. And this poem mainly explores the after effects of war, post-traumatic stress disorder, where after a traumatic event, the soldier now feels scared. He gets nightmares. He's constantly affected by the war, by his incredibly violent actions. So now moving on to connections and how the poem can compare with others. So as this poem is about war, that means that it can easily be compared with other war poems such as Bayonet Charge. However, it also talks about the effects of war, so that you could compare it with War Photographer. So with Bayonet Charge, for example, the poem ends with his terrors touchy dynamite, the after effects of war, the PTSD, touchy dynamite being like an image of the soldier being incredibly fragile. And in Simon Armitage's Remains, the poem in the final line, "His bloody life in my bloody hands," constant effects as if his hands have been permanently stained by blood. The poem can also be compared with War Photographer on the effects of war. So in the poem War Photographer, where the war photographer is cleaning up the images, 100 agonies, compared with, again, in Simon Armitage's poem, Pain Itself, the Image of Agony. So word agony, which is an extreme pain, is used in both poems, and it just shows the extreme, even visible pain that can be seen of the victims. Remains can also be compared with Exposure. Both of them are in the first person. However, Exposure doesn't make full use of first person, normally using we and us, like we turn back to our dying. Whereas in this poem, as I've said, Simon Armitage has written Remains in the first person. It's a personal experience, and the use of the personal pronouns furthers the effect on the reader. And finally, interpretations. So I feel that this poem mainly is, and ultimately, is about the permanent effect of war on the poet, not the poet, the soldier. So, for example, "But I blink, and he bursts again through the doors of the bank." So, even every time that the soldier blinks, whenever he sleeps, whenever he dreams, he's constantly reminded of the horrible image, of the horrible and violent actions that he'd had to do in the past. And that stanza ending with, "and the drinks and the drugs won't flush him out." So it's gotten to such a point that the soldier has turned to drugs and alcohol to attempt to cleanse himself of this incredibly dirty and bloody memory. And as I said before, you always want to mention the effect of the poem, of the different language and structure features that you analyze. As I said, this can make up at least half of your mark. This has been an analysis of Remains by Simon Armitage by Hasan Adil. And make sure to like, comment, and keep in mind to always mention effect, and to check out my other videos as well. And please remember to make sure that you see every image, because I've only done analysis from my perspective. However, I may not have gone through every image mentioned in the poem. So thank you for watching the video, and I'll see you later. Bye.